Thank you very much, Professor Bose, uh, for the kind words. Actually, when Dr. Santanu Mishra talked to me about this group and told me that you organize monthly seminars, I was quite fascinated. But when I came to know it's a structural geology and tectonics group, then I asked him straight away, how do I fit in? And he said, no, it will be good because uh, there are uh, there are a lot of things in the Koyna scientific deep drilling program that are that deal with structural geology and rock mechanics. And then I slowly came to know about the different activities of this group. And uh, I must say that I am really thankful to you all for providing me this opportunity to share my views on a very important solid earth science program of this country. I must also say that I am quite privileged to be a part of this program, to be associated with this program from the beginning. And, uh, and I'll try to share how this program evolved and what we have achieved so far and where we are headed to. At the same time, I must say that this is a very big program, and I really cannot do justice in a short 40 minutes talk. So what I'll try to do is to give a flavor of the program and some important results. But I also requested Professor Shantanu Bose, and I'll do that even now, that there are certain elements of this program which need to be dealt with in much more detail, and a number of individual scientists who are working on the specific problems. I think they would uh, they would be more suitable to give specific talks on each of these problems. uh, I would also like here to acknowledge several colleagues at the Ministry of Earth Sciences, the BGRL, where I'm presently located, and of course my previous institute, CSIR in GRI, ICDP, and several others. And it is really not necessary to mention. I mean, here that I'm sorry, it is necessary to mention here that this program was conceived by Professor Harsh Gupta when we were at NGRI, and later on this program has been taken up and funded by the Government of India, the Ministry of Earth Sciences, where I am currently working. And Borehole Geophysics Research Laboratory has been set up as part of this program. So I'm thankful to the secretary, the previous secretary, Dr. Sailesh Nayak, and the current secretaries, Dr. Rajivan, immediate past secretary, Dr. Rajivan, and the current secretary, Dr. Ravichandran, and many, many other colleagues at BGRL and NGRI, as I mentioned. But also, we are we are a member of the International Continental Scientific Drilling Program, and I acknowledge their help in certain technical aspects of this program. Well, the list is numerous, so I'll thank everybody, and I'll start this talk. So what I'll try to do is to cover certain aspects of this program. I'll start with a few slides on scientific drilling, and this is essentially because I was told that there are a lot of students in this group, and the first few slides I would really address them. And then I would talk a little bit about the reservoir triggered earth seismicity at Koyna in Maharashtra, the key science questions and the need for drilling. Then this program has been planned in a number of phases, so the preparatory phase and the deep drilling phase. And I'll touch upon a little bit of them, and future plan. And maybe I'll include a slide on BGRL if there is time, and research opportunities. So the cartoon here, really, I don't have to explain to this audience. This is how it is. And when I was very young, I kind of believed in the picture on the upper panel, in the top picture there. But very soon, when I matured and I started working with people like Dr. R.U.M. Rao and Dr. R. Srinivasan, Professor Dhruva Mukhopadhyay, I had some interactions with him, and very soon I realized that the real world is much more complicated, and that's probably shown in the cartoon below. So I would like to make a few points. Geoscientific insight into the deep earth processes is mostly based on observations made at the surface, indirect evidence through geophysical investigations, or increasingly through modeling. But as we know, several critical Earth science system processes and Earth system processes and records of the environmental and past climate change are difficult to observe from the ground surface only. Hence, despite the great progress achieved in solid Earth science during the past few decades, truly ground-truthed knowledge of the dynamics of the Earth's crust are limited. And this is the bottom line, that the direct access to the interior of the Earth's crust is only possible through drilling boreholes and making a suite of several measurements at depth. For example, one of the important Earth processes is to study earthquakes. And the study of earthquakes has been going on for several decades. However, we still are struggling to answer certain questions. I chose one pertinent thing here. What will it take to advance from the current empirical models of earthquake initiation and fault slip to a full physics-based understanding of rupture processes? Now, this question is a very broad question, and a number of studies are necessary to actually address the different facets uh, of this topic. For example, what's the internal architecture of the fault zones? What are the absolute stress levels of the fault during an earthquake? As we know, the stress is the most critical parameter. How stresses recover to prepare for the next event? How one earthquake promotes or inhibits another? How material properties affect the tendency to fail either catastrophically rather than creep, and so on. If you look at the cartoon on the right hand side, this is from Kanamori and Brodsky in 2001. The top here actually shows the spatially averaged stress on a fault varying over geological time. Tectonic stress slowly builds up along a fault until it reaches the local strength defined as the critical stress necessary for failure. And that's shown by the dashed line on top, the red dashed line on top. And then an earthquake occurs, and with a sudden stress drop, a new earthquake cycle subsequently starts. But that's a very simplified case. The more realistic case is shown just below it, where uh, the complications include variable strength, variable loading rate, and variable stress drop. And therefore, the real world is really complex. Uh, I will go to, I'll just like to point out that if we really want to study earthquake nucleation, then we need to address or need to study a number of uh, factors, a number of aspects, a number of problems associated with the nucleation, such as the structure and deformation. We need to know the rock strength properties. Very important things are fluid pressure and fluid chemistry, particularly of the fault zones, the temperature and the stress regime, the permeability of a fault zone, and fault frictional strength, for example, is one of the key areas that really cannot be completely studied by in situ methods, but a lot of laboratory studies are necessary, advanced laboratory experimentation are necessary to to know more about the frictional strength of the fault. And the subsurface fracture pattern, of course, and how and their interplay with the ambient stress regime. So this is a simplified, mind map of earthquake nucleation, and to really get to know each of these different parameters is is a big challenge, and the you have to conduct different kinds of experiments, different kinds of measurements. You have to drill deep. In many of the cases, you have to drill deep and get the data from depth. Otherwise, we would be only doing the surface, we would be only studying based on the surface measurements. This cartoon from the San Andreas Fault Observatory at depth actually inspired us to take up this Koyna program. The is basically, if you want to know the answers to all those questions, you have to ask the earth. The earth is very knowledgeable, but you got to ask the right questions. That means you got to put your sensors at proper places, you have to put the proper sensors so that you get what you want, things like that. Now this observatory, the San Andreas Fault Observatory at depth, actually was the first big study in this area, and it showed how the sensors placed in a deep hole drilled through an active fault zone can capture measurable signals. Apart from the earthquakes, of course, the scientific drilling has touched different areas of science, and you can see the gamut of the various the overall the goals of scientific drilling that have been employed worldwide to study so many different processes. And this is really because that scientific drilling has the unique advantage of providing exact, fundamental, and globally significant knowledge of the composition, structure, and processes of the Earth's crust, and thus helps to confirm or reject models based on surface studies. This picture is from ICDP. Okay, with this background, I now come to the Koyna seismogenic zone. As you can see in the geological map on the left, Koyna is located near the west coast in the Deccan in the westernmost part of the Deccan Traps. Koyna is actually on the Western Ghat escarpment. Can you see my mouse pointer?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
We can see it.
So the bottom we show the picture of the Koyna Dam, which was impounded in 1962, and the dam height is 103 meters, and the reservoir volume is 2,800 million cubic meters. On the center, you have the seismicity map of the Koyna region. Now you can see on the north you have the Koyna reservoir shown in blue. The south you have another reservoir, the Warner reservoir, and if you look at the distribution of seismicity in this area, you can see that it's basically bounded by these two reservoirs. So the seismicity is confined within a 20 kilometer by 30 kilometer area, and outside this, really, you don't have earthquakes. Now, soon after the impoundment of the 1962, soon after the impoundment of the Shivaji Sagar or the Koyna Reservoir in 1962, the seismic activity in the area got enhanced, and for the last 55 plus years, this region or this area is characterized by recurrent seismicity. The largest triggered earthquake ever anywhere in the world, a magnitude 6.3, happened here in 1967. And in the wake of that earthquake, a surface rupture zone was formed near the near the Koyna reservoir, that's shown with with the two dashed lines, north northeast, south southwest trending dashed lines. Uh, the depths of the earthquakes are mostly within the top 10 kilometers. So essentially below a kilometer up to about 10 kilometers. A very few number of earthquakes actually go beyond 10 kilometers, but you have to understand that there are errors associated with the depth information as well. But if you look at the subsequent pictures, we can very clearly see that the seismicity is the majority of the earthquakes are located between 2 and 8 kilometers depth. This the Deccan basalt is about a kilometer thick in this area, and below that we have the granitic basement, and the seismic activity here is modulated by annual loading and unloading cycles of these two reservoirs. I'll show you a picture very soon. Actually, here on the left hand side, you can see the changing reservoir levels throughout the year and the frequency of the earthquakes greater than magnitude 4 during 1967 to 2016. And you can immediately see that there is a good relationship between the water levels and the frequency of the earthquakes through the year. Essentially, when the monsoon happens, there's the loading cycle. So the reservoir gets loaded and the number of earthquakes increase. And after December each year, when the unloading cycle starts, there is also, you can see a small peak in the earthquake frequency. So essentially, this area has a strike slip faulting, is characterized by strike slip to normal faulting environment. And because of these unique features, for example, the recurrent seismicity in the last 55, 60 years, the largest trigger earthquakes here, the activity being modulated by the annual loading and unloading cycles of the reservoir, we consider that this is a natural laboratory to study earthquake mechanics. Unlike, for example, the San Andreas Fault and many other fault zones, which are plate boundary faults extending over 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers, and it's really difficult to pinpoint a particular area, to zoom in a particular area to launch detailed investigations. Koyna offers us such a case, and this is, of course, a very it's the ideal site to study reservoir triggered earthquakes, because over 100 other sites in the world there have reported reservoir triggered earthquakes. However, in most of the cases, the activity has decayed and almost ended within a few years of the impoundment of the reservoir, but not here. Okay, so I'll move a bit quickly now. So the seismicity clusters that have been recorded by detailed seismological monitoring, particularly by NGRI during the last few decades, are shown here. And again, you see that there is a good clustering of earthquakes, particularly in 5 or 6 different 2 by 2 kilometer zones. There have been uh, uh, clustering of earthquakes, and one such block D we chose for detailed studies. On the right hand side, as you can see, this is the Donichivada fissure zone shown by the dashed lines, and you can see that the earthquakes align beautifully within a very narrow zone, almost along the alignment of the Donichivada fissure zone. Now, the depths, I already spoke about this. So you can see the depth distribution of the earthquakes. This is the Varna cluster, and these are the Koyna cluster. So you have basalt about a kilometer, followed by basement. And a very interesting thing here, this study is from Rao and Shashidhar in 2016 of NGRI, where the focal mechanisms of 50 well-studied earthquakes are plotted. Now, one can see that both strike slip and normal mechanisms are found here. And also, there is a periodicity also, which they have tried to uh, see from this plot. Uh, on the x-axis, you have the year 1965 onwards up to 2015, and on the y-axis, you have the latitude. Which means that we need to explain also why both strike slip and normal occur together in this area. And if we believe that there is a periodicity, then why? So, number of questions are there. Now, I'll also like to show a slide on the Donechiwada surface rupture zone. As I said, immediately after the 1967 earthquake, magnitude 6.3 earthquake, Geological Survey of India mapped this surface rupture zone, this northeast, southwest trending surface rupture zone shown on the shown on the left panel of the screen. If you can see these lines, these broken lines, they represent the fissures. And in the late 90s, NGRI carried out a soil helium survey over this rupture zone. This was no longer seen on the surface because the fields were cultivated. And so from the reports of the Geological Survey of India, helium traverses were laid along these fissure zones. And you can see that the helium peaks really very closely follow these fissures, which indicated very clearly that even 30 years after the 1967 earthquake, the fissure was open, and this could be the surface manifestation of the deeper fault zone. If you look at the seismicity picture, this is a recent seismicity picture, and you can see the clustering of the earthquakes along the Donechiwada fissure zone again. So, which means that this Donechiwada fissure zone, or now we can call it the Donechiwada fault zone, is still active. Now, several studies have been carried out in this area, starting from 1970s, and they have established the association of the triggered earthquakes at Koyna with the precipitation-driven loading and unloading of the Koyna and Warner reservoirs. However, the triggering mechanism is little understood, and our knowledge of the physical properties of rocks and fluids in the fault zones and how they affect the buildup of stress for extended period is really limited by the lack of data from the near field region. And this led us to take up a scientific deep drilling program, where we wanted to drill deep into the hypocentral zone at a depth of about 5 to 6 kilometers, and set up and carry out several measurements there, as well as set up certain sensors for long-term monitoring to see the temporal changes in physical, chemical, and mechanical properties of rocks in the near field of the earthquakes. And that information, we think, would be a very valuable addition to the existing knowledge to trying to understand the mechanism of the reservoir triggered earthquakes and their persistence over such a long period of 55 to 60 years. A number of science questions were also formulated, essentially related with the stress and magnitude, how they vary, and co-seismic deformation and their evolution, rock strength, the control of rock strength on the recurrent seismicity, thermal structure, role of reservoir, nucleation and propagation of earthquakes, and so on and so forth, fluid pressure and permeability within and adjacent to the fault zone, composition on origin of the fault zone fluids and gases, etc. And all of these are very important to address this question, and they need uh, access to deeper parts of the zone, which can be had through drilling. So this is basically the template of the scientific drilling program in Koyna. What we did was the preparatory phase, which is shown on the left hand panel. We drilled a number of exploratory boreholes shown by the black solid circles in the periphery of this zone. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9. So all these boreholes were exploratory boreholes, and these are all cored boreholes ranging in depth from 982 to 1522 meters. In the pilot phase, now after 1500 meters, after we reached 1500 meters and got a lot of geological as well as some geophysical information about this region, the pilot borehole was planned because one cannot really go for such a deep borehole, 5 to 7 kilometers directly. There has to be a pilot drilling phase in line with other international programs. And in the pilot phase, we drilled a 3-kilometer borehole going through about 1.25 kilometers of Deccan basalt, followed by the granite gneiss basement. And in future, we will the plan is to drill a deep borehole up to 5 to 7 kilometers depth and reach the zone where the earthquakes are occurring in order to be able to measure the changes, the pre-seismic, co-seismic, and post-seismic changes in physical, chemical, and mechanical properties. Okay, so the first two phases are now over, and I'll give a brief summary of these two phases. In the exploratory drilling, we learned a number of things. I mean, before this program, we had no idea how thick this basalt was, the Deccan trap was. So now we know that the thickness of the trap varies from 412 to 1251 meters. Actually, on the eastern side of the Western Ghat escarpment, the trap thickness is almost 2 times that in the western part of the escarpment. We did not find any infratrappean sediments. That means the Deccan trap lies in this region directly over the granite gneiss basement. A very thin weathered granite layer, which many people call it a transition layer, has been seen in most of the boreholes. That's about a meter or less. One interesting finding that we saw was that although the surface relief changes from almost 100 meters to 1000 meters in this region as you go from west to east, the depth to the granite gneiss basement is relatively homogeneous. The undulations are within about 100 meters, and that indicates that the escarpment is most likely a post-Deccan trap feature. The basement rock now we know is comprised of granite gneiss, granite, migmatite gneiss, and amphibolites. The basement rocks show clear evidences for fluid movement and multiple episodes of deformation. We were able to directly measure the subsurface temperature up to a depth of 1500 meters. We found that it was 55 degrees Celsius. And based on this and measurements of thermal properties of the rocks from the recovered from the boreholes, we were able to do a good model of the temperature regime and we came up with estimates that at a depth of about 5 to 6 kilometers, at a depth of about 6 kilometers, the temperatures would not exceed 120 to 130 degrees Celsius. That was a very important piece of information for the deeper drilling programs. And then many of these boreholes have been instrumented with borehole seismometers, and these have really led to very this program is being carried out by NGRI. The data acquisition is being made by NGRI in these borehole seismometers, and the data is really very good, noise free, as you would expect, because the seismometers have been placed in the granite gneiss basement below the Deccan traps, and that has led to improved earthquake locations. Also, it has helped to reduce the threshold of detection of the low magnitude earthquakes. So here you can see the trap thickness and the basement in all the 9 boreholes, or the 8 boreholes are shown here, and you can see that the uh, depth to the basement, the depth to the granitic basement is more or less within about 100 meters. Now, one of the boreholes, we actually recovered a 1251 meter thick Deccan basalt core, and this is, to my knowledge, the longest core of Deccan flood basalt from the Deccan traps, the longest continuous vertical core. All the boreholes were vertical, so I must tell that. And on the left hand side, you can see that the contact is so sharp between the basalt and the basement rock. As I told you, the basalt essentially sits directly on the top of the Precambrian basement here. So we were able to identify, do a logging of the score, and we were able to identify from physical studies, from megascopic studies, about 46 lava flows, including 9 giant plagioclase basalt flows. And 74% of this trap layer was massive, and 24% vesicular, and so on and so forth. We were also able to, shown here on the left hand panel is a plot showing the distribution of the thicknesses of the different flows, and on the right you can see the different features that we saw in the basalt core. Iron staining around the fractures, which showed that water really percolates down deep up to at least 1500 meters depth. Then brecciated fault gouge, evidences for these vesicular pipe vesicles, particularly in the compound flows. We have these pipe vesicles, red bowl beds, and giant plagioclase basalt. These were mostly found at the base of the trap sequence. The plagioclase laths can were actually are as long as up to a centimeter or 2 long, and several millimeters in width. So my colleague Surajit Mishra actually carried out some petrographic studies which allowed us to know more about this basalt. And then because the earthquakes are located all in the granitic basement below the Deccan traps, this was the region where we wanted to really focus on. There are several problems on basalt that can be taken up using the core, but that's not what I'm talking today. I'll be particularly restricting myself to the granite gneiss basement. And in the granite gneiss basement, in the cores up to 1500 meters depth, we were able to see several deformation features, slicken lines, fault zones, and fractures, and granular flow, and some pseudotachylite material also. I mean, this is being studied in more detail to confirm, but it looks like I mean chloritic or chloritic material, and maybe pseudotachylitic material also on the fresh fracture surfaces, slicken sided surfaces. More features here, and you can see certain offsets on the core. On the right hand side, you see injection veins filled with possibly pseudotachylite, and crushed zones. And on the extreme bottom right, this is actually a rare piece of shallow reactivated fault zone, which we got in one of the boreholes. Okay, so these were the geological logging was carried out on these boreholes, and measurements of fractures and fabric are shown here. On the right hand panel, you can see this is the RQD plot, and the RQD plot is the rock quality designation, and the percentage is on the x-axis. It shows a percentage from 0 to 100. The higher the percentage, the greater is the quality of the rock, quality of the core. But you can see that in some of the boreholes, the rock quality, rock quality falls to very low percentage levels, showing the highly fractured nature of the core in many of the boreholes. In some of the other boreholes, of course, like KBH5, you can see in the middle panel, the rock quality designation is relatively much better. But in KBH6, again, almost the entire basement section is highly fractured, which means that we only got small pieces of core, less than 10 centimeters. So these localized fault fracture zones with poor RQD were mostly found near the earthquake clusters. And such zones, we had a more detailed look at the core, which showed that such zones are characterized by crushed rock, very high fracture density, brick-shaded sections, which were cemented by soft materials, mostly clay. So my colleague again, Surajit Mishra, carried out certain microstructural studies on these basement core samples and was able to see under the microscope fault gouge and fractures and different sets of fractures actually, and several other features. And then he was also able to look at the pictures in the scanning look at the slides in the scanning electron microscope, EDX studies, etc. And we came up with certain preliminary results, which are as follows: that the basement beneath the Koyna is basically granite gneiss with interlayering of granites and migmatitic gneiss. Rocks are intact and competent with prominent igneous and metamorphic textures, evidences of intensive shearing, a lot of features of brittle deformation, which are present as fault breccia and fault gouge. Secondary precipitations are very common along most of the fractured zones, and therefore there are clear evidences of possibly water flow in the subsurface, in the deep subsurface. We also carried out rock strength and elastic properties measurements using the facilities available in the country. So we actually carried out these experiments at CSIR SIMFAR in Dhanbad. And we measured the unconfined and as well as the confined, with the strength of the rocks under unconfined and confined conditions, stress strain relationships. And you can see that the values of the unconfined the UCS measurements here show that there is a large range in the values for the different rock types, which means that the basement granitoids in Koyna region are essentially very heterogeneous in terms of rock strength property. And then more Coulomb failure envelopes and stress strain curves, things like that. We'll not go into a lot of detail today, but I want to show that the first measurements of the rock strength of the Archean granitoids show that the strength is actually on the lower side. As you see, if you see the figure at the bottom of the at the bottom right hand panel, the rock strength granites from different parts in the world are plotted, and the colored red, blue, and green, those are the values from Koyna, the averages from Koyna, and you can see that they are on the lower side. They are lower than the usual granite rock samples. On the top panel, you see that the deviation of the post-failure planes from the pre-existing fracture and fracture plane orientations indicate that weak planes induced by frequently occurring earthquakes. So you can see that the fabric and fracture orientations on the rightmost panel C, figure C, you have the post-failure orientations that we got from the laboratory measurements, and you can clearly see that in addition to these weak planes already existing, there are other planes along which the failure happened. The spatial variability in rock strength implies the effect of ongoing seismic activities, possibly. Localized weak zones indicate close proximity to damage or fault zones. And the low rock strength may explain the frequent occurrences of low magnitude earthquakes, because this rock is not able to accumulate a lot of stress, and therefore that may be an indicator of the frequent occurrence of low magnitude earthquakes in the region. We were able to do a very good temperature study up to 1500 meters depth, and on the left hand side you see the temperature depth profile, the thermal conductivity data plotted there, a textbook example of a heat flow determination, and we came up with a heat flow of 43 milliwatt per square meter, very normal heat flow at par with what we find in the Dharwar or Bundelkhand cratons. And on the right hand side, we were able to use this data to compute the crustal temperatures, and found that at a depth of about 6 kilometers, you get to temperatures of 120 degree or so. Now we go to the next phase, that is the pilot borehole. And on the left panel here, I show the location of the pilot borehole. You can see Kadoli is the place on these data, on these in the northern part of these dashed lines. Dashed lines represent the Donechivara surface rupture, and the Kadoli is the place where the originally the surface rupture zone was mapped, and we drilled the pilot borehole along the same alignment, but 5 kilometers to the south of it, as shown in the figure. And we drilled, we made a we customized the borehole essentially. We designed the borehole in such a way that we can get certain data sets, we can carry out certain measurements, and we can also, if necessary, instrument the boreholes at a later date. The well configuration is shown here. So this is the pilot borehole site. We drilled up to 3014 meters, cased and cemented it. 1247 meters of Deccan basalt, followed by 1760 meters odd crystalline basement. This is the deepest in the crystalline basement in the country, the deepest drilling that has been done in the crystalline rocks in the country. And we drilled with indigenous expertise and resources, using a unique hybrid drill rig, which was able to do mostly using the air hammer technique, but also switch to mud rotary whenever necessary, for example, during coring or during certain critical zones uh, uh, where highly fractured zones and things like that. The bottom panel, you can see a bird's eye view of the drilling site. It was a very major experiment. I will show a small movie here. Can you see the movie?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, this just a quick, maybe a minute. So you can see the big drill rig and all the associated equipments, mud pumps, cementation units, generators, compressors, the on-site field laboratories, and it's basically in a no man's land. And Yeah, the windmills in the background. And then so this was a totally automated drilling. As you can see here, the pipe, the tripping in and tripping out processes were automated. Each rod was close to 9 meters long, and we had the shale shakers, cementation units there, and far the white um, uh, trailers are actually the accommodation, because we had to spend almost 8 to 9 months at the site to complete, from start to completing the drilling and the measurements. So I'll close this. Now, if you see, we as I said, 6 months went for drilling, but several other associated preparation and logging and hydrofrac testing, it all took almost 8 months. You can see the field labs at the site. This was a fantastic experiment. We also, the most of the borehole was uncored, but as you can see from this figure and the progress of drilling, we also took some small cores. Up to 1500 meter anyway, we had full cores, so we did only very selected coring uh, below 1500 meters depth. So these are the coring operations. So getting the core out and then marking the core, and then we have a optical scanner which can give us a 360 view, 360-degree image of the core, and you can see the cores about 100 millimeters in diameter, that is 4 inches in diameter. And from this drilling and the measurements that we carried out, essentially we were able to get a lot of new critical new information, such as subsurface fault fracture zones and their properties, in situ physico-mechanical properties of the rocks at seismogenic depths, subsurface stress and temperature regime, orientation of the subsurface faults, fractures, and their disposition with respect to the maximum horizontal stress orientation, and many other information. But these were the critical ones, and I'll touch upon briefly. So you can see the geophysical logs here in the basement section. We are showing the logs from 1500 meters to 3000 meters here on the right hand panel, and you can see the different logs, the velocity, gamma, caliper, self potential, Poisson's ratio, Young's modulus. The shear anisotropy is also shown, neutron porosity, density, and the resistivity, different resistivity logs. And we were able to get the physical properties of the basement formation in quite good detail. But very importantly, what we found from these logs, combination of these logs, as you will see, below a depth of 2,100 meters, you can see seven zones, really zones with really anomalous properties, really anomalous physical properties. Low electrical resistivity, low density, high porosity, low VP and VS, high Poisson's ratio, low Young's modulus. So we tried to look at these zones more carefully, and you can see here a plot showing how the velocity VP and VS and the shear wave anisotropy computed from the cross dipole sonic logs are plotted here, and you can see the anomalies in these seven zones. So in all these 7 zones were actually characterized by high shear wave anisotropy. We studied the acoustic properties of these zones. We did a shear wave anisotropy analysis, and you can see in all cases here, you can see 2 zones are shown on the left side and 2 zones on the right side of the slide here, and you can see the anisotropy is really high in both in all of these zones. So this is a more detailed anisotropy analysis. And then we also acquired very high resolution images of the borehole, both using formation microresistivity imaging tool as well as the acoustic televiewer. And we were able to get a hold on the detailed fracture patterns, the fracture orientations throughout the borehole, throughout the basement column. And here you can see we are showing here three important types of fractures: small aperture fractures, and then borehole breakouts. In the middle panel, you can see these vertical parallel lines. These are the borehole breakouts. The axial failures, essentially, these are very useful to get information on the stress regime in this area. And then on the last, on the right hand most figure, you can see fractured zones, primarily showing tensile fractures of varying widths. And I mean, this is just a glimpse of this. I mean, there is a lot of work that has been done on these fractures, and a lot more needs to be done. Uh, uh, and those are being carried out right now by colleagues at BGRL. So you can see we did the anisotropy analysis, and so you can see here that we found actually that the anisotropy is mostly stress induced, and in such cases where the anisotropy is mostly stress induced, the fast polarized shear wave orientation gives a fairly good indication, fairly good picture of the principal horizontal maximum stress. So we got a good idea about the principal horizontal maximum stress orientations from this analysis. Then we looked at the borehole breakouts and the drilling induced tensile fractures from the image logs. And you can see on the right hand panel here, we plotted the SH max orientation and as well as the SH min orientation, which is obtained from the drilling induced tensile fractures. And we were able to get a mean SH max of north 9° west. Then we looked at these stress perturbations, and again I come back to these seven zones here. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 below 2100 meters depth, and where all the geophysical properties were highly anomalous. But also here you can see the azimuth of SH mean plotted here, which are all very anomalous in those zones. They deviate from the north-south orientation along these zones. We then also carried out an online gas monitoring and analysis study in the borehole, which means that as the drilling was going on, we set up a lab on the site where we had a mass spectrometer, and we were able to analyze and sample the gas that comes out from the borehole from the different depths in the borehole, and along with the cores during the coring process, during the cutting process, etc. Here is we were able to measure, actually we measured 3 or 4 important gases: carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen, helium, and a few others. And I show you the anomalous helium signature that we got from this borehole. As you can see, again, below a depth of 2100 meter, on the left panel you can see, below a depth of 2100 meters, the helium levels reach very anomalous levels, much higher compared to the atmospheric concentration of 5.24 parts per million. We even measured up to 7.8 parts per million above the atmospheric levels. And these were certainly indicative of fault fracture zones below 2100 meter, which are still permeable. We measured the isotope ratio, and we found that this helium is mostly crustal or atmospheric origin, so there was no mantle component. And if you now look at the picture on the right hand side, this is the one we got in 1996 or 1997 when the helium survey was done by NGRI in the Kadoli area. Now from the pilot borehole, we got about 5 kilometers south of this, and the helium levels are are very similar, up to about 7 to 8 parts per million above the atmospheric. And therefore, this was one very good indication that the surface rupture zone, which was earlier mapped up to Kadoli only, actually extends, possibly extends much further south along the same alignment. And when we integrated the geophysical as well as the geochemical data, we found a very good correlation. As you already must have seen, the 7 zones of highly anomalous geophysical properties and high shear wave anisotropy, etc., they were all below 2,100 meters, and the zones of high helium were also below 2,100 meters. And so essentially, a number of such zones are also associated with substantial enlargement in the borehole diameter, which means that the borehole really passed through big fractured zones below 2,100 meters. The enlargement of the borehole diameter in the form of cavities or washout zones is likely due to the presence of fracture zones in the formation. And these zones are characterized by high fracture density, as you saw from the image logs, indicating that the borehole punctured multiple fracture zones. And therefore, the study suggests that the borehole KFD1 intersected the Tonechivada fault zone, or maybe its subsidiary faults. So this was a very clear indication. So I'll skip this. I already spoke of this. Now, quickly, I'll go into the stress profile because we were able to measure directly the stress magnitudes of the stress here using hydrofrac tests up to 2,500 meters depth. This is the one of the deepest stress measurements, direct stress measurements in the crystalline basement anywhere. And we have got these, as you can see on the right hand panel, we have the stress orientations from hydrofrac. Then bottom, the shown in red is the stress orientation that we got from the breakout analysis, and the last one in blue shows the stress orientations from the drilling induced tensile fractures. And you can see that they are relatively consistent. So north-south, almost north-south orientation. Now, when we plotted the stress, the minimum horizontal stress, the maximum horizontal stress, and the SV, you can see that the on the left panel here, the SV and SH max are very close to each other. And so we tried to increase, we did a small exercise, small calculation essentially, where we tried to increase the pore pressure by about 10% above the hydrostatic, and in another case, we reduced the coefficient of friction by about 5%. And in both cases, we see that the faulting regime actually can change very easily from strike slip to normal and vice versa. You can see the SV and SH max. They basically, in one case, SH max becomes smaller than SV. In the other case, it becomes higher than SV. So these are some of the interesting things that we found from the stress regime. And the final figure here is the Coulomb frictional failure criteria. We did some small calculations here. You know, for the continental crust, the mu values are essentially between 0.6 and 1, the coefficient of friction. And we plotted our stress data on this plot. And you can see that if we consider pore pressure as 0, which is shown in the red, then our data plots between 0.2 and 0.6 coefficient of friction. Whereas if we take the hydrostatic case, they plot between 0.6 and mu is equal to 0.6 and mu is equal to 1, which means that the Koyna region is really critically stressed with 0.6 to 0.1. So critically stressed for hydraulically conductive fractures. Whereas for the dry ones, you will need certain other conditions to cause failure. Now we looked at the fractures also, because wellbore image data, they help to characterize the orientations of the surface fractures, and the nature of the faulting environment can be constrained from the analysis of both fracture and stress orientations again. So we identified about 2,200 fractures from the image logs, and the plots are shown here. On the left hand side you have the SH max, then in between, in the middle one shows the strike and the pole of the fractures, and the last one the dip of the fractures. And you can see that we have here the SH max from the breakouts and DITFs, and the fractures from the image log analysis. The fractures strike subparallel with the SH max in many cases, in most cases, and they dip very steeply, 40 to 75 degrees. Because we had the image logs, we actually could orient, we could orient the course also. So now we have a situation where the fractures strike parallel to subparallel with SH max, and they dip steeply, and therefore we have a case of normal to oblique strike slip here. What are the implications of this? The strike azimuths of majority of the fractures obtained from the analysis of borehole images are parallel to subparallel. The orientation of the N-echelon fractures, were, you know, the tensional cracks, fractures, and mold cracks associated with the Donachiwada fissure zone were all between north 10 west and to north 25 east, indicating, and our data are quite consistent with this, indicating the strong influence of the fissure zone in the pilot borehole location. The breakout rotations. Now, one thing which I probably skipped, one of the figures showed are the breakout rotations along those 7 anomalous zones. And the breakout rotations may represent the expressions of stress perturbations caused by the proximity of the Donachiwada fault or its subsidiaries. The Koyna pilot borehole has intersected the Donachiwada fault zone or its subsidiary fracture zones at multiple depths below 2,100 meter, and that the fault zone is active is born from the recent seismicity data. Now, all these information actually help us in guiding the next phase of deep drilling, which we intend to go up to 5 to 7 kilometers depth and set up a deep borehole observatory. In summary, I think I will not repeat these, but you can read them quickly. We have a transitional strike slip to normal faulting environment, so we are able to explain many of the observations in the Koyna region. And we also know now from this data that the Koyna region is critically stressed, and therefore favorable conditions exist for failure to occur with small changes in pore pressure or frictional strength, or both. A slide on the Borehole Geophysics Research Laboratory here. So that concludes the Koyna presentation. But in BGRL now, for those who are not aware, the Ministry of Earth Sciences, Government of India set up the Borehole Geophysics Research Laboratory in Karad, which is about 50 kilometers east of Koyna. And here we are trying to establish facilities in scientific drilling, borehole testing, core repository, information and outreach. Under borehole testing, we have already started several investigations like well logging, stress, borehole seismology, metrology, hydrology, pore pressure studies, geothermics, and rock physics. This is a picture of the core repository that is now fully functional at BGRL. We have about 10 kilometers of core samples from Koyna region, all properly catalogued and arranged in a repository which has 3 tiers of a racking system. And we have a good core scanner here, which takes the pictures of the 360-degree pictures of all the core samples in very high resolution. And we are trying to also build the facilities for core for preparing the samples. We can store cores up to 4 degree plus 4 degree centigrade also in cases where it is required, for example, from the ocean drilling, the sediments, etc. And I would like to tell the young students who are attending this seminar that there is a lot of opportunity for participation as well. we have already a number of groups, research groups from different institutions in the country have already carried out different kinds of investigations on the core samples taken from BGRL. And I think I would like to say here in no uncertain terms that much more participation is necessary to fully utilize the value of the core samples that have been recovered uh, at such an expense and with such an effort over the last few years. So with this, I would like to close my presentation here with the concluding line that the scope of scientific deep drilling and applications of borehole geophysics are immense and are poised to grow rapidly as both industry and academia realize its potential to provide cost-effective and direct information on the processes operating at depth. Scientifically exciting and new research opportunities have opened up in frontier areas that can be addressed through borehole geophysics. And I would like to also say here that we have made a start to this endeavor, and we hope to carry out much more exciting research in the coming years. And I would like to solicit participation from different research groups in the country as well. I take this opportunity to thank the Surface Structural Geology and Tectonics group for this opportunity to share my views with this distinguished audience. And I end with this picture, beautiful picture of the Koyna pilot borehole site when the drilling was going on. I thank you very much for your attention.